Welcome, everyone, to another episode of TrekWars at OSU. That's Oregon State University. My name is Dr. Joseph Orozco, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State. And I'm also the co-director of the Anares Project for Alternative Futures. The Anares Project is a forum at Oregon State that's inspired by the work of science fiction author Ursula K Le Guin. And it's a forum for conversations, initiatives, and other projects that try to imagine a future free of oppression, exploitation, domination, war, and empire to the fullest extent possible. And one of the things that we have as a project is this webcast that we're calling Trek Wars at OSU, an attempt to think about how we can think about our current political, social, economic realities through the lenses of different kinds of science fiction franchises. So in today's episode, what I want to share with you is a discussion uh, thinking about why Star Trek and the Star Trek universe in particular is something that might be useful for thinking in our dystopian times. That is, why is Star Trek something that we might want to turn to when we are living in a world that seems to be faced with all sorts of different kinds of crises? Not only are we living in a time of the COVID-19 pandemic, but looming ecological, social, political, economic crises just seem to be in the offering. And so why might Star Trek be something that we could turn to for thinking about how to deal or to think about these kinds of issues? And so I want to share with you a talk that I have given in many different places that I call Going Boldly, Star Trek in Dystopian Times. And so the way that I usually get into this way of thinking is, as I do with so much of my thought, is through the thinking of my students. And so I often reflect about how my students are thinking about political and social issues. And so I've started to do a lot of research into the political and social attitudes of millennials and Gen Z students. And Gen Z here I'm taking to be students between the ages of 18 and 24. And there's been a lot of interesting research done about these students and their ideas. And so in particular, right, one of the things that we find about our young people today between the ages of 18 and 24 is that they find themselves living in a highly politically polarized world. Uh, they are a group of people, young Americans, who are very politically engaged. And so when you look, for instance, at some of their engagement in just the electoral realm, you find them participating in the 2018 and the 2016 elections in some of the highest levels that have been measured in over 25 years or so. But what's interesting about a lot of these young people is that they participate in ways that are unconventional, so to speak. They're very much less interested in being parts of political parties like the Republicans or the Democrats. They're much more focused on issues. When you look, for instance, at participation in particular kinds of political parties on college campuses and university campuses in the United States, many of them are not involved in those political parties, so to speak, but they're involved in issue-based groups, things around school shootings, ecological issues, and so forth. This is partly because for so many of these young people, there's a certain kind of attitude that the political parties are controlled by elite groups that don't have their interests at heart and that prevent their preferred candidates from being able to ascend to positions of power. And so there's a big distrust amongst young people between the ages of 18 and 30 about the traditional political parties and how well they represent their views. But folks who are in this age group have some very, very strong opinions about the state of the United States and the world in general. So this is some results of a study that was done at Tufts University that was trying to measure young people's attitudes since 2016 at the post-election polls. And what's really striking about this, that when I saw this kind of data, I was really kind of shocked that what you find with young people who are my students, you'll see them that they're very concerned about the values of the American people, whatever that may be. More shockingly is that they're losing faith in the promises of American democracy. So more than half of the people in 2016 and in 2018 said that they were had no faith or very little faith in the well-being of American democracy. Uh, Almost a majority of them did not feel that things were uh, uh, something that democracy that they could have some kind of trust in. Um, Very few of them believed that improvements to American democracy would come anytime soon, anywhere within the next 2 to 4 years, right? So a majority of people, of young people, did not believe that the U.S. government would improve in the next even 4 years. But despite all these kinds of pessimistic attitudes about the shape of political values or the strength of American democracy, right? A large number of young people, both in 2016 and 2018, had hope that things would get better in the future. Not in the short term, but eventually things would get better. And so when I looked at some of this data, I was trying to figure out like what is the basis of the hope? Where is this coming from? And what can be done in some sense to nourish the kinds of hope that young people have, given that they don't have a lot of faith in political leaders, in political institutions, and in American democracy itself. And so, what I say here is that what a lot of young people want is, in some sense, a kind of nourishing of their imagination about what might be possible. There's many, many different kinds of polls that also suggest that people between the ages of 18 and say to 30, the millennials, uh, are really interested in big social change, are willing to consider transforming American society politically, economically, in ways that have never been considered before. This, in some sense, explains the rise of candidates like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? These people who are avowedly taking on a label of something like socialist, which for over the past 50, 60 years has been anathema in American politics to call yourself this. And so many people are flocking to these kinds of candidates and thinking about changes to the way in which the American economy can function. Many more young people are giving expressing some kinds of interests in doing away with capitalism as an economic system, or thinking about socialism as an alternative. And so how can we think about, as an educator, what I think about is how can we think about educating the imagination of a young group of people who really want to think about taking apart and having some participation in society for big social change. And in these kinds of discussions, I think that one of the ways that we can think about nourishing imagination is through science fiction. So how can science fiction help us as a way of thinking about social change? Right, and I take a kind of lead from Mei Jemison, the NASA astronaut, who appeared in several, or at least one Star Trek episode as a transporter chief. Right, she admits that she was always inspired by Star Trek and the characters that she saw there to become an astronaut and to do her work. And what she has said before is that really good science fiction is a kind of mirror to individuals and to society. And so this quote I love by Mae Jemison is this: what really good science fiction does is to allow you to reflect on yourself, your values, and your beliefs. It uses a fictionalized science as a mechanism to push us to think about what we're doing. Society is influenced by technology, and the technology is influenced by society, our aspirations, and who we think we are. And so in some sense, I think that science fiction, really good science fiction storytelling, can be a tool that we use to assess not only who we are as individuals, but as a society, and to push the boundaries of our imagination to think about what might be possible. And this is a lesson that we also get from Ursula K Le Guin. One of the things that I think that's really interesting about Ursula is in her novels and in her short stories, the ways in which she tries to get us to think about what a good society might look like. And so I like this quote by her a lot, that is a reflection on kinds of crucial ideas like justice. We may not know our own injustice if we cannot imagine justice. We will not know freedom if we cannot imagine freedom. We cannot demand that anyone try to attain justice and freedom who has not had a chance to imagine them as attainable. Right. So what I think that Ursula is trying to get at here is that part of what is required in social transformation is a strong kind of imagination to think about what kinds of societies we want to build and to use those as touchstones for our social activism and our inspiration for change. Right. We need to be able to imagine a better kind of life in order to be able to work toward it to some way. And science fiction, good science fiction like Ursula's, can do this. It gives us these visions of hope that we typically call utopias. But more than just simply giving us visions of what a future might look like, science fiction helps us to imagine alternatives in a way that I think is very particular. In her uh, uh, National Book Award that she received in right before she died, she in her speech she talked a lot about the commercialization of literature, and particularly authors who try to uh, play to the market, and the really big corporate players that dominate literature by picking up things that they think are going to sell really well. And so here she was picking on some very big sort of publishers, and also the way in which corporations like Amazon have an effect in terms of what gets distributed in the market. And so what she wanted to talk about was the power of science fiction in particular, and speculative fiction in general, to help us to imagine the world as something that human beings can change. And so she said in her award acceptance speech, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." Right. So this is I think, a really powerful sentiment. The idea that in different human eras, there are these grand ideologies that we sort of think are going to last forever. And the divine right of kings, this idea that structures of power are set in place because some divine power has so ordained them to be. This is a kind of worldview that's existed for the human family for thousands of years. And it was only about 300-400 years ago that human beings started to think that there could be a different basis for political power rather than what the divine wants to see in the world and what kind of political structures the divine might want, right? Groups of people started to get together to think that maybe political power should be structured upon the idea of the consent of the governed. And that totally shifted the ways in which society works and gave us human rights revolutions and all these different kinds of ways of thinking about living together that didn't exist before, because we broke through what seemed to be solid. And so, in this kind of way, Ursula was saying that we now live in a world in which we think that a market economy and a political system built around protecting capitalism is something that's going to exist forever, that there are no other alternatives to this. But we've seen in human history that all sorts of systems that are envisioned by human beings can be re-envisioned. This is the power of our imagination, and good science fiction can be useful for helping us to think about what alternatives might be possible, what different kinds of ways of cooperating and living together we can attain. But the reality is that not all science fiction is alike. And nowadays, we live not only in a time in which we face really large crises that loom ahead in the future, but so much of our popular culture, particularly in the ways that it presents science fiction and speculative fiction in general, is full of these kinds of dystopian themes of technology that has run amok and is threatening our well-being, or we are looking at envisioning worlds in which there's more and more finer forms of oppression and domination, right? It's hard to imagine the future as good given some of the kind of speculative and science fiction that we see that's popular nowadays. And so this is where I like to introduce Star Trek. because I think that Star Trek is a different kind of storytelling than some of this dystopian work. And in order to think about this, I like to sort of reflect on a quote by George Takei, right, who played Mr. Sulu from the Star Trek, the original series, right? He's said before that at the core of Star Trek is Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future. So much of science fiction is about a dystopian society with human civilization having crumbled. He, Roddenberry, had an affirmative, shining, positive view of the future. So I think that this is a hallmark of Star Trek, that it has a very different kind of view than a lot of dystopian storytelling that we have nowadays. And I think that this can sometimes be a liability for Star Trek. Um, in talking about Star Trek, often with my students, they often don't know very much about Star Trek, or if they do know about Star Trek, they often feel that it's kind of hokey, that it's kind of silly in a way, and they often fixate on this kind of the positive view of the future that Star Trek represents, that they find unrealistic because they've been growing up so much thinking about looming crises in the future, and they have grown up on diets of dystopian stories from their adolescence. And so the Star Trek vision for them is often something that they feel out of touch with. And the way that I often get to talk with them about this is to realize that Star Trek does have this vision of the future that is utopian and positive, but that's partly because Star Trek isn't always a rosy vision of the future. Right, so this is a scene from one of my favorite two-parter episodes from Star Trek Deep Space Nine called Past Tense. And this is a scene where Commander Sisko and Dr. Bashir have beamed down to Earth, and through some kind of malfunction have ended up in the 21st century, approximately the year 2024, so just a few years from right now. And they've beamed down to this sanctuary zone in San Francisco. And so the story is that in 2024, uh, the economic inequality in the United States had gotten so severe that there were these sanctuary zones in most major American cities that were essentially concentration camps for all the people who were poor, unemployed, homeless, and so forth. And they had been corralled into these areas of the city that were dangerous, full of disease. And this was a way to keep them out of sight of the people who were essentially getting by and who were middle class or above. And so in this episode, you see the characters trying to figure out where they are. And Cisco says something that he believes that they're in the 21st century. And Bashir responds, 21st century history is not one of my strong points, too depressing. So Star Trek presents this kind of vision of our immediate future as quite grim. Not only is there this kind of economic inequality that's represented in the episode's past tense, but of course, there's in the Star Trek universe, there's a looming third world war that's going to come before any of the storytelling that we start to see with Kirk and Spock and so forth get off the ground. It's a devastating world war that kills almost a third of all the human population, and it comes to be a near extinction event. And so Star Trek presents this kind of vision that the universe that we know of Star Trek is possible only because at some point human beings were able to manage to work together to accomplish that future. And so Star Trek is really a story about what human beings are capable of if they can overcome certain kinds of problems and limitations that can lead to their virtual extinction. And this kind of hope, I think, is represented in this kind of graphic, that what I call that Star Trek represents utopia out of a world of dystopia. So on this slide, you see, right, the flag of the United Nations that was created shortly after World War II in 1948. And then next to it is the flag of the United Federation of Planets, established according to the Star Trek universe in 2161. And I often tell students, take a look at the ways in which these flags mirror one another. And I think that there's a reason for this in particular. I think that when you think about Gene Roddenberry as a boomer, as someone whose big experience in their adult life was World War II, you have to realize that this was a devastating experience for so many people, right? And it's a devastating experience for the human race in general, right? The experience of World War II in the 20th century uh, was about the annihilation of close to 100 million human beings through not only direct warfare, but casualties as a result of the war. And so a devastating experience. And also the use of things like atomic weaponry at the end of World War II represented the possibility of the extinction of the human race on this planet. And out of this world, this devastated and destructive world, came this kind of sense of cooperation amongst many of the nations of the world, particularly led by the United States at the time, to try to draft documents and to create a body that would attempt to prevent such a war from ever happening again, and trying to eliminate the conditions of the world, the kind of poverty, the kind of degradation, and the kind of racism that would lead to a war like that. Try to eliminate those conditions. And so a lot of these hopes and aspirations were embodied in the United Nations, and then also in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1948. And so I think that what the United Federation of Planets is an attempt to sort of kind of capture that spirit as well, that this is something, the United Federation of Planets was something that was created as human beings are starting to get on their feet once again after some really, really devastating, destructive parts of their history, where they were able to realize that there's something out there in the universe to explore, and that they can work together in a much more cooperative way, not only amongst themselves, but with alien races. And so the Federation represents this kind of attempt to put the human race on new footing. And I think Roddenberry was trying to say that this is not a kind of imaginative leap, but this is something that we've done before as human beings. We have the capacity to learn from our mistakes in a really profound way, to build new worlds out of our destructive tendencies. And so this is the kind of vision of utopia out of dystopia that Star Trek represents. So what are the kinds of themes that come out of Star Trek as a utopia that I think can be useful for us thinking in dystopian times today? I think one of them is this focus that Star Trek has, is that the future is about diversity, right? So in the Star Trek universe, there's this Vulcan saying about called Edik, right? Infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And Star Trek is about this exploration, not only of space, but of relationships of people who are very dissimilar from one another. And so here you have just a kind of sampling of all the different kinds of species that you find interacting in Star Trek, and then also in the corner there, the original races that formed the Federation in 2161. Right? There's this emphasis that Star Trek has, that part of what we need to learn about and to become really excellent at is thinking about how to deal with differences, and that in dealing with differences and learning from differences, we become stronger. Related to this, I think, is this other theme, right? That friendship matters. Over and over and over again, there are these stories that emphasize the connections between people. And I think that Star Trek is really not necessarily unique, but this is something that, this is a theme that comes up over and over and over again, the strength of relationships, relationships built that are almost like family. And I often tease my Star Wars fans because I often say, you know, if you look at something like Star Wars, the relationships that are discussed are often so screwed up, right? That that families are broken up, families can't get along together. There's so much mistrust. It's rare that you have good friendships in the Star Wars universe. But this is something that's emphasized over and over and over again in the Star Trek universe, that friendship matters for achieving human excellence, and building those kinds of social relationships is a hallmark of what makes human life good. Tied to this, I think, is this notion that cooperation matters. So I think what's really interesting is that a crucial scene that you find in almost any iteration of Star Trek, going all the way from the very beginning, is a really crucial scene called the conference room. And here you have scenes from three different series uh, of people sitting around talking about a problem and trying to figure out what to do. This is an iconic scene in Star Trek. And I think that this is really an important kind of moment for a Star Trek episode, because what it represents is an opportunity for professionals, some of the best minds in the universe, to get together to think with one another about how they want to solve problems. So one of the lessons about Star Trek is that cooperation together, thinking together, talking together, deliberating together is how problems get solved. And that this is a crucial kind of way in which human beings achieve, right, a good life or achieve some kind of excellence, is this notion of thinking together in a room face to face with one another, and bringing all of their excellence and their expertise to bear with one another. So this is part of what Star Trek thinks is something that's, going to help us not only move to utopia, but part of what living and maintaining in utopia is about, is this crucial kind of conversation, problem solving together. The other theme that I think is really important for Star Trek, and this is something that I think puts it at odds with kinds of current science fiction storytelling, and particularly the kind of stuff that you'll see something, for instance, in Black Mirror, another franchise that I love, but the emphasis in things like in Dark Mirror is often that technology is something that we need to be very wary of. And Star Trek often presents a different kind of story here, that technology, in fact, can be our friend. In fact, it can be something that is taking us to new levels that we've never imagined before. And the way I usually like to think about this or talk about this with people is through the idea of First Contact Day, April 5th, 2063. And what's represented by this holiday, as it's depicted in the Star Trek movie First Contact, is the first time that human beings are able to meet another alien species from the galaxy. And in this scene here that's depicted, you have the engineer Zefram Cochrane, who is the creator of warp drive in the Star Trek universe, the technology that allows human beings to travel faster than light. It's because of this technology that he built that attracts the attention of the Vulcans. And the Vulcans finally decide that human beings are worthy of contact because they have been able to develop to a certain kind of level, technologically speaking, that allows them to travel faster than warp and to move out into the stars. And so here you have the scene of Zefram Cochrane meeting a Vulcan explorer who turns out actually to be um, Spock's grandfather, right, in the Star Trek universe. You also here you have a representation of the Phoenix, which is the first warp-capable ship. But here the idea is that technology can be something that takes us in new ways and allows us to have different kinds of experiences and have grander opportunities than we might not otherwise have. And this is through the use of technology. But in order to be able to do that, we need to be able to develop an ethical relationship to technology and to scientific research. And part of what this means is that we have to be clear about what our needs are from technology. And this is a theme that's really, really old, going back in some sense to some of the very first kinds of science fiction stories like Frankenstein. Right? What I often like to talk about is how the real story of Frankenstein is not the monster or the fact that the monster was created, right? The real story is about how Dr. Frankenstein rejected his creation and the reactions that he had to his creations because he himself was so egotistical and self-absorbed that he decided to engage in scientific research without really understanding why he was doing this. And so Frankenstein is a kind of moral tale, not necessarily about the dangers of science, but about the dangers of our own moral inability to understand ourselves and our needs and our interests and why we're building the kind of technology that we do. So Star Trek has this kind of idea that there's so much that technology could be trying to do. So here you have a representation, for instance, of what's called the replicator in Star Trek, right? These machines that are able to reassemble matter in different forms and to create food. And so this is a way in which the Star Trek universe is able to eliminate hunger and suffering in this kind of way because we no longer have to worry necessarily about lack of food as long as we have a replicator. But we could have built so many other things. We could have built more bombs, more weapons, and to a certain extent, we did do this, and this led to World War III, right? And so, what's interesting, I think, then about the Star Trek universe is that it represents a world that has sort of come to some kind of consciousness raising about what's really important, what kind of values really need to be prioritized, and that technology is not something that we need to be fearful of as long as we can understand ourselves the, the most or best. And so um, what I typically talk about with Star Trek is this idea that Gene Roddenberry enunciated when he was asked what Star Trek represented for him. Right? He says Star Trek speaks to some basic human needs, that there is a tomorrow, and it's not all going to be over with a big flash and a bomb, and that the human race is improving, and that we have things to be proud of as humans. No, the ancient astronauts did not build the pyramids. Human beings built them because they're clever and they work hard, and Star Trek is about those things. And so I think that this is, in some sense, some of the importance about Star Trek um, in dystopian times. That Star Trek can be an avenue for us to think about how we can move forward from these dystopian times by giving us a kind of vision, like Ursula Le Guin says, of an alternative world in which we have thought through about our needs and our interests and are trying to think about bringing our expertise and creating those opportunities for us to think together, to work together, and move forward as the human family. And so, what would it take for us to really build a better future? I think this is what Star Trek represents, an attempt to try to think about the conditions that would be required to do something like that. And so I think that this is why I often teach classes about Star Trek, because I think that so many of our young people today are yearning for these stories that will help them think about how to use their imagination to build these kinds of better worlds, and that will think about creating opportunities for them to bring their creativity, their knowledge, and their aspirations to build a better world. I look forward to hearing from you about your thoughts about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe and how it can be useful for thinking about building a utopian world and whether or not it's useful for thinking about our lives in these dystopian times. If you have questions or comments, please leave them for us. You can also reach us at Anarres Project, that's ANARRES project.org, which is our website, or you can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on Instagram. So until next time, thanks very much. I look forward to hearing from you and your comments. And so live long, prosper.